Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you could please take your seats. We'll be starting our event. Welcome to Chatham House. We are convening to have a conversation about everyday life in Russian-occupied Ukrainian territories. My name is Larissa Lutsevich. I am the head of Ukraine Forum here at Chatham House. And I'm really pleased to have an amazing panel with me today. Katerina Hinkulova, she is the producer of The Occupied, the film that was made about the everyday life in Kherson, as it was before occupied, and the family living through. This was done by the BBC World Service and is, I think, an amazing testimony to illustrate what it is, war on Ukraine right now. And Alison Griffin, who is the head of Influencing Children in Crisis from Save the Children Foundation here in the UK. I'm sure a well-known organization to many of you, working to relieve the suffering of children impacted by the war in Ukraine. So today's conversation will be a mix of our discussion, but also a short screening of the film. And also, we'll have a special video addressed to you from Dmytro, who is a journalist that filmed the material that made it into the film. And Dmytro, unfortunately, could not be with us all the time because of electricity and other disruptions related to war. He's in the area where actually it's now quite dangerous and risky for civilians. But I hope that also with your conversation we'll be able to understand a bit better what it takes for civilians today being in Ukraine. It is, of course, 1 year soon of this unprovoked invasion by the Russian Federation. And all wars, and we at Chatham House know, we focus on many of them, unfortunately, are horrific for civilians. But I think this one has a particular twist to it, vicious twist to it, where Putin, failing to achieve his military objectives on the battlefield, is weaponizing energy, is fighting the war of attrition against civilians, basically suffocating what is the lifeline to modern urban life, energy at the time of winter. And the toll for vulnerable, for children, is really high. I think there's also something we forget and is now not on the spotlight, but the weaponization of civilian nuclear. We still have one of the largest nuclear power stations being captured by the Russians and used to blackmail the West in not supplying Ukrainian necessary weapons, and also a constant threat, a beaming threat to many. I think now throughout this year we did see an evidence that this is a genocidal type war, because with his craving for Kiev and trying to connect Russia to this ancient Kiev-Rus civilization, Putin almost is compelled to destroy what stands on the way between him and that dream, and what stands in between that is Ukrainian nation that is fighting and that disagrees that it is one people with Russia. And obviously we have horrific list of war crimes that Russian armed forces are performing. Ukrainian prosecutors general has registered over 6,000 of these crimes, and most of them are related to the violation of the conduct of war. But we also have instances of deportations of children, separation of families, erasure of cultural identity, and obviously there are some numbers that UN puts on the number of civilians that are dead, but I don't even want to quote them because I think they are very estimates and very much far away from reality. Because if you just recall what many Ukrainians remember, if they were asked, what do you remember from last year of war? It's the siege of Azovstal and Mariupol, that city that was basically razed to ground. The numbers of civilian deaths there is enormous. And we don't even know because we don't have access to that city today. So, of course, behind all these big numbers are human stories, and I think this is what we are here today to talk about, human story. And I would like to say that our event is recorded, so we will share a recording after the event, so you will be on camera if you ask questions. And please do share it with your networks to raise awareness about civilian at war. So I'd like to bring in Katerina to tell us a little bit about the aspiration of the BBC World Service, why such project you think is important, what was an inspiration for you, and how this came about?
So I'm, just to set the record straight, I'm one of the producers. So the other one of the producers is Michael Simkin, right there in the front row, and Albina, who's the director of this film. So they'll be...
We'll bring them in.
Yes, we'll be able to, when you see the short version of the film that we're going to see a bit later, then how it was made and how it was filmed, they'll be able to talk a bit more about it. What I wanted to focus is on just how big this story is. So this story, the war in Ukraine, it's soon going to be 1 year, and I remember 24th of February very clearly, well, partly because I'm Ukrainian myself, but also because I was on that day, I was taking part in the morning meeting that we have. So we have in the World Service, we have these 8:40 every day, Monday to Friday, we have these editorial meetings where it's all language services, it's the newsroom, it's all we all get together and we discuss the events of the day. And it's interesting that today I was taking part in this meeting this morning in this meeting, and whilst for past many months the people who represent the part of the BBC where I work, it's the Europe Hub, the Europe region of the BBC World Service, we would have to do most of the talking. We would have to be give updates on what's the latest in events in Ukraine. Today it was different. Today the main story was this horrific earthquake in Turkey, in Syria. And whilst as we were talking, as we were just discussing which teams are going where, what's going to happen, the death toll grew as we were speaking. And when we started, the confirmed death toll was maybe 200 people, then later it was hundreds, and by last time I checked, it's over 2,000 people. And it's a terrible, shocking story with so many humans affected. But at the same time, this whole BBC News machine was kicking into action. What can we do? How can we tell this story better? We had these immediate plans unfolding for BBC correspondents from Istanbul, from Beirut. It's foreign news gatherings, so it's people like Quentin Somerville and Tom Bateman, whom you're probably going to see on the news tonight, but also our colleagues from BBC Turkish and BBC Arabic, who are all rushing in to cover this story. So whilst here today we're talking about a completely different story, but what it kind of almost reminded me of that on the morning of the 24th of February last year, we were all, on the one hand, fighting these emotions, which for many of us, for myself and for some of my colleagues who are also Ukrainian, but also for Russian colleagues, it was very hard, new, shocking development. But we were also kind of kicking into this gear of how we're going to cover this story, how we're going to show these events. And the World Service and BBC News wider, but World Service in particular, what we do is we tell these stories from lots of different angles. So we do the daily news, we have a look on the live page. We tell how it affects, stories from the front line. You will have seen, reports by Andrew Harding or by Quentin Somerville. And we're also able to put these stories into context to show how they compare to other events, to recent events. Going back to Quentin, who was there in March last year, and he was saying, standing in the city of Kharkiv in the ruined street and saying, does this remind you of something, and he was referring to Syria and how the Russian indiscriminate shelling of Syrian residential areas. We've seen Sarah Rainsford, who went to the railway station in Kiev and was speaking to the refugees there who were trying to squeeze on the trains as they were leaving Kiev. Then Zhanna Bezpechuk from BBC Ukrainian, she was in Bucha in the first couple of days after it was liberated. And I remember there was a shot of her standing there amongst all the ruins and saying there was a smell of death here, smell of death in the air. So those very important first-hand accounts on the ground is something that the BBC News and BBC World Service are determined to bring, because this is really, really, really important in this war, which is not just a war of countries, war of troops, it's a war of narratives. And setting the record straight and showing what the situation is like on the ground is of absolutely key importance. And that's why stories of civilians in occupied territories. So this film, Occupied, shows the life of one family, and we've touched on that because some of Ukraine was occupied even before 24th of February 2022. One of our colleagues from BBC Ukrainian who is originally from Donetsk, went to Donetsk just before the war as it happened, and then brought back this extraordinary account of how the city lives under the Russian control, and had to do this really difficult journey, but did bring back this first-hand account and the what people are saying, and it was of absolute key importance. What we're seeing now, nearly a year into this war, is inevitable fatigue from people, from the audiences, because it's how much war, how much suffering can you take? And we almost, well, predictable but also worrying is that it's this fear that journalists have that Ukraine war, the headline with Ukraine war, might become a turn-off for audiences. And that's why it's very important for us to keep looking for stories that will keep up that interest. And why it's important, because and why this interest has to be kept up, because ultimately they're stories of people, they're stories of humanitarian problems, humanitarian issues. And if that interest is kept up, public interest is kept up, then respectively the politicians, the governments, NGOs and charities will be able to keep focusing on this war and keep helping the civilians who are affected by it.
Thank you. Katerina, yeah, I'm sure that kind of anxiety is also shared in Ukraine, that, you know, of course, despite living this through a daily life of news torrents and ballistic missiles, Iranian drones, and everything that comes, people fear that the war may be forgotten. I mean, of course, it so far, unfortunately, helps when Putin does horror, like last time in Dnipropetrovsk, when the building was civilian building was bombed and so many people died. It brings back the headlines, but I think you're right that it's important to be an eyewitness to that for. I guess for that empathy that Ukraine needs at the moment, that Zelensky is trying very much to speak to when he speaks to audiences around the world. He very much speaks to constituents, not just politicians, to understand the suffering, but also to understand the position of Ukrainians to continue fighting despite all the suffering. And I think that's important narrative that is needed. So thanks so much for providing such material to audiences globally, because that was released at the BBC World, not just UK. The film. And then I'd like to now bring in Alison, that they are focusing obviously on children, something that is often overlooked, but is that future of Ukraine's recovery and the post-war Ukraine. That is, the fate of children is very often the first impetus for mothers to flee Ukraine, to make sure that their children have opportunity abroad, but actually most of Ukrainian displacement is happening within Ukraine. most people did not flee to the European Union. I would say it's almost like 40 to 60. Many of Ukrainians returned in the summer, hoping that the worst is over. Of course, now we see with this targeting of electricity. But tell us a little bit what you see on the ground from your charitable work there, and what would you like to see more in terms of policy, perhaps measures?
Yeah, thank you. Well, Save the Children's founder actually, over nearly 100 years ago, said that every war is a war that's waged on children. And I think anyone who's seen Occupied and has seen the girl under the table, I think that resonates so true even now, nearly 100 years later. We've seen children in bunkers saying how much they miss the sunlight, children saying goodbye to their fathers through train windows. That was quite a poignant Quentin Somerville piece for me. Vehicles and schools targeted despite having the word children clearly painted on them. On average, more than 2 children are killed every day and 4 are injured, but as we've already said, those figures are likely to be far higher. More than 20 schools are being attacked on average every single day, and children have experienced and witnessed the most horrible crimes, including sexual violence. In the first few weeks of the Ukraine war, so February, March, a child became a refugee every single second. It's now estimated that nearly 8 million people have fled Ukraine, and around 40% of them are children. Children who sometimes have been separated from their parents, so they are unaccompanied, and obviously that puts them at greater risk of exploitation, abuse, and trafficking. So we'll obviously see in a bit in the clip what life is like living in a war zone, but from Save the Children's perspective, we're working inside Kherson and a number of non-government-held areas across Ukraine. And we've heard from families in Kherson back in November. They were collecting water from puddles. They were queuing for more than 1 kilometre just to buy fuel. And there are 80,000 children just in Kherson. And it still obviously is suffering daily attacks on its civilian infrastructure. And children themselves, they've spent far too many hours in the last year living in a bunker without sunlight. So one of our psychologists who we're working with described children arriving from Mariupol as arriving in a catatonic state. Alexander, one of the boys, not his real name, 9-year-old, who arrived in a Save the Children centre, was so withdrawn and distressed, he wouldn't let anybody near him, he wouldn't let them speak to him, he wouldn't let them touch him, not even his parents. That is the kind of trauma that children are facing in these circumstances. It was only actually when the psychologist's therapy dog came in that he started over a period of days gradually being able to connect again and start that long process of recovery. And then Save the Children's obviously operating in a humanitarian context, as you imagine, delivering, making sure there's fresh water, delivering food, blankets, the sort of basics, but we're also doing things like delivering bunker kits via local partners, containing toys, games, arts and crafts, well-being activities. Our number one priority is just helping children be children again. And when it's across a country like this, it's so important for the future, of course. And of course, Save the Children and partners and volunteers are working day and night across the front lines, risking their own lives to get aid to people. And the incredibly intense risk management processes and systems in place. The right vehicles need to be there, the protective equipment for staff and volunteers to be able to make minute-by-minute decisions when an airstrike has happened, for example, to be able to cross those lines and deliver that all-important aid. And this is happening, it's been really brilliant that the media is showing these stories, but it's obviously happening behind the scenes, ongoing for the entire year. And then from our position, I work in Save the Children UK. The UK government has been commendable in its humanitarian response. So within a fortnight of the invasion, it had committed £120 million in humanitarian aid. And the total UK support now is around 400 million. And I guess from our perspective, we work across the world. We would love to see this kind of political and economic and financial commitment to other crises, both for moral reasons, but also for strategic reasons. And we also believe there's a huge opportunity for UK leadership when it comes to ending impunity. We've talked about Syria already, but there's several places like that. Yemen, another example, where war is being conducted with blatant disregard for civilian life and numerous credible allegations of war crimes and violations against children and civilians. The UK's shown important leadership in this area. It's particularly in securing the referral of alleged Russian atrocities to the International Criminal Court. But from Save the Children's perspective, we would love it to be championing much more of a child rights-focused approach. So perpetrators of violations against children can be held to account, so impunity is reduced. Whether that's the International Criminal Court, the UN Commission of Inquiry, or Ukraine's own domestic investigations, for us, obviously child-specific accountability is really, really important. And of course, it's worth mentioning, I think, as well, over the last year, it's not just the UK government that's played a role in keeping, and media, in keeping attention on Ukraine, but also the UK people, the British people, incredible outpourings of solidarity and financial generosity. The DEC appeal raised £300 million, one of the most successful appeals in history. And willingness of British people to welcome refugees into their homes is, you know, it's been phenomenal. It's been amazing to see. You know, that it sort of is a picture of a world of what British foreign policy could and should be like, and what British international leadership could be in this case. So from our perspective as sort of committed internationalists, really keen to find effective ways to channel all of that empathy and support towards Ukraine, into broader issues to, you know, protect and uphold humanitarianism in general.
Yes, thank you, Alison. I think it's in Ukraine, it's very clear where Ukrainians see allies and appreciate all the assistance. And if you ask Ukrainians who has been standing steadfast alongside Ukraine, it's three countries stand by. It's US, UK, and Poland. The countries that really were there from the first day, that provided what was needed to defend Ukraine, that in case of Poland, it took a lot of Ukrainian women and children as they were fleeing in the first days. But I mean, I think role of UK is clearly appreciated to a big degree. It's almost like a hero country now in Ukraine. And not just for Boris going there, I assure you, but people understand much widely what UK has done. But interesting that you point to the need of bringing it back to a rule-based order and seeing how out of this suffering we could become stronger as a community against you know, this impunity. Ukraine will do its best, and I do know that Ukrainian civil society human rights defenders in particular are already doing a solid job, including the most recent Nobel Prize winner group that has, even before this second Ukrainian-Russian war, documented over, I think, 15,000 crimes that were already committed. So we've seen it coming. It's just now that the scale is so much bigger and many more people are impacted. So I would like now to screen that short version of the film. Well, it will take around 15 minutes, and then we'll have a special address from Dmytro, and we'll come back on stage for a discussion. So we'll just take a seat here while our AV team will show a clip on the big screen. Thank you.
My name is Dmytro Bahnenko. I'm a local journalist. I've lived in Kherson, Ukraine, all my life, and now my city is under Russian occupation. I start to film, to record history as it happens.
Россия здесь навсегда. Никакого возврата в прошлое не будет.
My partner is Lydia, and we have a 5-year-old daughter, Ksyusha. This is our family story. Life under occupation. At the center of the crisis that is changing the world. There had been fighting around Kherson for days. Every day, we hear explosions and sirens. They had taken our city. Everyone is scared. It's a big risk to get my camera out. We move our mattresses into the corridor, where we are protected by extra walls. And we play games to keep Ksyusha calm.
Добраніч, паук. Добраніч, добраніч.
For the first few days, everything freezes. Schools are closed, government buildings abandoned, factories and offices empty.
У нас есть буряк, картошка, капуста, томатная паста. Ксюша. Ксюська.
We try to stick to our routines to keep things as normal as possible for Ksyusha.
Ти все одно навіть реагуєш на доньку, ти намагаєшся чимось, донька вкладається спати, ти занурюєшся в новини, бо складно було це хоч якось витримувати. Постійні вибухи, які ми чули, і прильоти.
In the first weeks of the war, I start going to an Orthodox church of Ukraine. I get to know the priest, Father Serhiy Chudanovich. Today, he is burying a Ukrainian soldier.
Сьогодні день особливий. Ми провели народний похорон. Ви приймали кожен з вас.
Some are worried that honoring a dead Ukrainian soldier will be seen as a provocation by the Russian military.
Те, що Сергій ховав цього солдата, це характеризує Сергія як людину. Те, що він не... вони могли прийти, росіяни.
Я думаю, що вже храм був давно під спостереженням, тому що туди поприходили люди, які попали їм на карандаш точно. І я за це трошки корю себе, тому що я, але знов хто знав.
Херсон – це Україна! Херсон – це Україна! Фашисти! Фашисти!
Тому вийшло дуже багато людей. Прям, тисячі. І видно було, наскільки шоковані росіяни. Тому що в їх картинці світу їх тут зустрічають як визволителів.
Confused, the Russian soldiers don't seem to know how to react. But on March 21st, after 3 weeks of demonstrations, everything changes.
Этими гранатами какими-то все печет.
Ми ходили десь в місто, бачили росіян. Я посміхався.
It's 23 days into the occupation. We are staying at my family home. I grew up here with my brother and our sister Marina. Marina is pregnant. She and her husband Vitaly arrived last night, escaping a battle outside town.
Привет, Ксюха. Привет, Димыч. Привет, Маришка. Спрятался. Смотри, тут братик.
Vitaly works on a private luxury estate located close to the front lines. Now, my sister Marina is checking how much smugglers charge to get people out of town.
До границы с Румынией и Молдавией за $2000. Прошу с пониманием отнестись к цене. Я свои риски оценил в данную сумму. Всем удачи.
Conditions in Kherson are getting worse. And with news in short supply, I cycle to Father Serhi's church. But when I arrive, Father Serhi isn't there.
Кто приехал? Приехали, ну, типа менты. Говорят, вы кто такие? Мы с милицией, с полицией.
То есть они его забрали?
Ну, можно, ну, не задержали. Как это называется? Забрали.
Had I arrived 5 minutes earlier, the Russians would have seen me too. And if they searched me, they could have found my videos. I too could have been taken away. I'm worried about Father Serhi's mobile phone. Did he have a chance to delete his text messages with me? I need to be more careful.
І шокуючі свідчення звірств окупантів. Слідчо-оперативні групи вже вивезли з території Київщини 410 убитих цивільних.
Був один момент такий, знаковий, напевно, для всієї країни. Це Буча.
Масові розстріли, людей просто посеред вулиці. Окупанти зв'язували їм руки білими пов'язками, а потім стріляли в потилицю.
Всего того, что произошло в Буче, от всего того, что мы увидели и свидетелями чего мы стали, я понял, что я не хочу говорить по-русски.
The reality of this war is impossible to process. How much does Ksyusha understand? What will she remember? Will it change her?
И я не хочу. Це поганий робот. Я завжди з тобою, чуєш? І мама завжди з тобою.
The Russian media talks of plans for a referendum. They want to create a pro-Russian republic to legitimize their occupation. It weighs heavily on my family.
Ух тишка. Чому ми залишаємось? Чи що зміниться від того, що ми вийдемо? Чи стане краще?
І мучить оце, що метушіння між одним варіантом і другим.
Тобто ми кожного разу обираємо не їхати. Виходить так.
Ну.
Three weeks after Father Serhi was taken by the Russian security services, he posts a video. He has escaped Kherson and wants to explain what happened to him.
Я стояв напівроздягнений, поставив на коліна, нагнули до стільця головою, притисли коліном, взяли дубинку, сказали, що зараз вони запхають мені в анальний отвір, розірвуть його. Це було дуже дискомфортно, дуже страшно і, відверто кажучи, в мене була паніка, я не знав, що мені робити. Коли мене почали кричати на мене, що я буду з ними співпрацювати, я сказав, що буду. Ну, так вийшло.
The Russian forces step up their campaign to rid my city of its Ukrainian identity. Ukrainian flags and symbols are removed. Russian flags now fly over all government buildings. And a senior Russian politician, part of Putin's circle, meets Kherson's new leaders. The message is clear.
Россия здесь навсегда. Никакого возврата в прошлое не будет.
For the first time, we begin to see ordinary people openly showing support for Russia by wearing a St. George's ribbon. It is sad that half of the population has already left Kherson. Now Vitaly and my pregnant sister are getting ready to leave. The Russian security services have taken over the resort and have threatened Vitaly.
Они приехали, это ФСБшники, все с автоматами. Ко мне подошел какой-то мужик, дал гранату, выдернул чеку и пошел. Подошел обратно, начал смеяться громко, улыбаться, там шутка-шутка. Приехал домой, говорю Марине, собирай вещи, бегом. Завтра выезжаем.
This is our chance to get out.
Що ж спить, ми продовжуємо збиратися. І оце записав інформацію про Ксюшу. І хто буде про неї піклуватися, якщо з нами щось трапиться. Я покладу сюди. Це її дитячий квиток, бібліотечний. І це повішимо на Ксюшу. Повішимо.
Важкий момент.
There has been recent fighting on the roads out of the city. We've heard many reports that civilians trying to escape have been attacked.
Чоловік сестри Діми подзвонив там зранку чи ввечері і сказав: ти ж розумієш, ми типу всі дорослі люди, в дорозі може трапитись все, що завгодно.
Ми стояли 8 годин на блокпості і казали, що десь Марина дізналася, що ми можемо переночувати у дитячому садочку.
It's too dangerous to film at checkpoints, but I film when I can. Ksusha watches cartoons and sleeps. After 2 days and more than 20 checkpoints, we are lucky. Because we are traveling with Ksusha and pregnant Marina, we are let through. Others have to wait, with no guarantee they will leave. After 3 months of being occupied, we cross into freedom and into a new chapter of our lives.
Вітаю! Дякую вам, що прийшли сьогодні на цей показ фільму, який був знятий перші місяці окупації мого рідного міста Херсона Росією. Ми з родиною зараз у Києві, у нас все нормально. Я інколи приїжджаю до Херсона, знімаю відеосюжети і беру інтерв'ю у людей, які ще залишились в Херсоні. За останніми даними, там залишилось близько 20% людей. Сам повертатись у місто я не хочу, а з родиною я зараз цього робити не буду. Тому що Херсон обстрілюють щодня російські війська і роблять це хаотично. Влучити може будь-де у місті. Вони стоять просто за декілька кілометрів від Херсона з того боку річки Дніпро. І тут якби питання, на що вони це роблять, не можуть прийняти український вибір херсонців, чи, я не знаю, хочуть зломити моральний стрижень містян, або просто руйнують все, до чого вони можуть дотягнутись. Складно сказати, але то я точно знаю, що цю війну проти херсонців і українців Росія точно програла. Я це відчуваю в собі. І я це бачу по своїй дитині, Ксю. Ми коли жили ці місяці в окупації в Херсоні, ми з дружиною злі намагались, з одного боку намагались втримати оцей ніжний дитячий світ Ксюші, а з іншого боку життя навколо, світ навколо змінювався з такою швидкістю, з карколомною швидкістю, що нам самим треба було це все осягнути, зрозуміти ці трансформації і як батькам донести це до Ксю. Наприклад, чому росіяни напали на українців? Тому що вони дурні і злі. Або що це за звуки? Це постріли гармат. Або чому я не можу дивитись мультики зараз? Тому що немає світла, тому що Росія обстрілює наші міста ракетами. І ми балансували на оцій межі, на її потребі в поясненнях, на межі її потреби в поясненнях і нашим осмисленням і відчуттям цієї війни. І все, що нам залишається зараз, це перемогти. Перемогти і закінчити цю криваву і безглузду війну Росії проти України і повернути життя собі і нашим дітям. Перемогти в тому числі завдяки вам. Тим людям, які прийшли на цей показ, завдяки вашій небайдужості, завдяки вашій участі. Тому що агресор розуміє лише силу. І допомога вашої країни, економічна і військова, для України наближає нашу перемогу і становлення миру в Україні. Дякую вам. Слава Україні!
Like most of you, I've seen the short version. I now realize that I've seen the short version before. Because, you know, I don't remember who said that there are decades that nothing happens and there are years that decades happen. And I think this is, we live through the time when decades happen. And of course, we at the distance feel it, but this is the story of people who were in the intimacy of the aggressor, were in the intimacy of violence that Ukraine has not seen, honestly, since the Second World War. So there's a lot to reflect on. I would like to invite you to share any thoughts you would like to with us, any questions that you may have to the film director, the producers. Albina is also here with us. So whoever would like to start, just catch my eye. I'll put you on the list and we'll go around the room. Janet. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Janet Gunn, and I'm a trustee of a very small British charity, the Bear Trust. And I want to make a few comments to Alison in particular, because we started an appeal on the 27th of February last year. And we haven't raised 300 million, I'm afraid, but we have raised nearly 500,000, which is for a tiny charity that has only one employee, and the rest of the work is done by by trustees on a voluntary basis. What we bring to Ukraine is on a tiny scale compared with what Save the Children and others can do. But it's aimed at all kinds of vulnerable groups in Ukraine. Elderly people, many of whom have stayed despite being in the most dangerous situations, right on the front line in places like, well, the places we've been hearing about today. And Bakhmut in particular, there are still thousands of people living there. Disabled people, elderly people, all sorts of people in need, and the internally displaced people and refugees who have fled. And we work with very small charities in Ukraine, voluntary groups, some of whom existed before this crisis, and some of which are new. There are boxing associations who have set up charities. There are business people who are volunteering in their own vehicles to fetch medicines for Kherson from other unoccupied cities during the occupation. And we get money to them very, very fast in small amounts, but they can come back for more. And they provide humanitarian aid. And this isn't just a plug for the Bear Trust. This is to say, make a real shout out to civil society in Ukraine, because something like 82% of the people in Ukraine are either donating or volunteering themselves. And it is a quite extraordinary and incredibly brave effort. We are sending money to people in the Donbass, people in Nikopol, which has been under bombardment across the river from the Zaporizhia power station for months now. And they're still working. They have not fled. They are still helping people. So just, you know, here's to Ukrainian civil society.
Thank you, Janet. And maybe, Alison, if you can reflect a little bit about your partners on the ground, because I agree with Janet. Of course, funds are important, but you need to have hands and that determination to go and risk your own life often to provide, you know, medicine for elderly or food or evacuate some people with medical needs. There are different stories. So well, how has been your experience?
Yeah, and great to meet you. I guess we are all one big ecosphere of humanitarian response. And we were talking earlier, weren't we, about the resilience of Ukrainians and people in other conflicts to just continue to risk their lives to, you know, deliver life-saving aid to people. I think for me, one of the interesting things is the innovation that's happened through the humanitarian response in Ukraine. So we've seen one of our sort of staple programming is cash transfer, so via smartphone, so people can, you know, it's not aid, it's cash that they can spend how they want to provide that level of dignity still, and we can obviously get that very quickly to people. But also people who've arrived at the borders. You know, I spoke to one person who works for a sort of a tech startup. She's developed an app, a pro bono app, and given it on a platform so people can start saying what they've got to give, and people can say what they need, and they can switch and geolocate and things like that. The sort of innovation in humanitarian response. There's lots to learn from that. You know, as Save the Children works with partners inside Ukraine and other contexts, we're sharing this information to, you know, make ourselves more efficient as we go on. Yeah.
And it's, I just wanted to add, it's very true with resilience and people risking their lives to help people to cross the front line, as you said, but also to try and keep things as normal as possible and fix things. Because so in Ukraine, as you all very well know from the news, the energy infrastructure has been under constant attack since the beginning of October, and that's been the main problem for the majority of the territory. So whilst on the front line, there's this very heavy fighting that affects quite a lot of people, but the energy shortage affects even more people, and people all over Ukraine are now living with constant blackouts. But the interesting side of it is how the energy infrastructure keeps getting fixed. So it gets fixed and then it gets attacked again, fixed and attacked. And it's an ongoing process, but it's like Ukrainians are not giving up. And one of my colleagues, Paul Adams, BBC's diplomatic correspondent, he just came back from Ukraine, and He's already written an article, it's up on the BBC News website, but he's also working on a longer documentary. And it's specifically about how that fixing of energy infrastructure works and how innovative and clever and resilient and all sorts of tricks that these engineers are using. And he's been out on the road with them, so do look out for it. It's coming in a couple of weeks' time towards the first anniversary. But it's really true how much of this, it's the combination of civil societies that I suppose was there. The seedlings were there for a long time, but how it all came to the surface and became this really important factor to help Ukraine stay alive and keep fighting.
It's interesting that many people mention this technological innovation. It's because also Ukraine had quite vibrant IT sector that was developing, right? I mean, it was around 3% of GDP. It may sound like not very big, but it employed millions of people, and many graduates from, Kharkiv and Odessa and Lviv were working, being subcontracted by Silicon Valley and other companies actually to code, and they all came in the volunteer code army almost, doing these kinds of apps that we now mention. Let's go around the room, please. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Just please introduce yourself and microphone, because for the recording we would like to get a voice.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here and sharing your experiences. My name is Michael Pugh. I'm a lawyer and academic. So a question possibly primarily to Katerina, but also Alison might have an insight on this. In the film, we saw that there were some children wearing the St. George's Cross, and I suppose my question is about propaganda in the occupied territories. Personally, living in Ukraine and Russia through the 90s, 2000s, and so on, I think that Russia molded the psyche of its own population in preparation for this occupation and this war now. But can you provide us with a bit more insight into what's happening in the occupied territories now in terms of bread, circuses, and other types of propaganda that Russia might be trying to exercise to win the hearts and minds and that battle which is going on?
So one of the when Kherson was liberated at the beginning of November, one of my friends and sort of colleagues, not BBC journalist, but a Ukrainian filmmaker, went out to Kherson and to surrounding areas and went around just talking to local people and kind of finding out what it was like firsthand, what the life was like. And one of the things that we're saying that in fact, if you watch the longer version of the film, you'll see one of the things that Dmytro talks about, that all the communication gets cut off at some point, and the Ukrainian TV channels get cut off, and the only channels that the local population have access to are Russian TV channels. So it's exactly what you're talking about. But what we also heard from a wider in the Kherson region, from the local residents, they were saying that telling us that Russian soldiers were going around houses and handing out these receivers that they could attach to their phones that would work with, I don't know, maybe some sort of military equipment or something, but they would receive Russian TV and they would be able to watch it, and they even showed these devices to visiting journalists. So absolutely, the whole propaganda front is very, very important to start affecting the local population and to try to convince them. And we've heard all kinds of things that people will be told that the Ukrainian government has fallen or Ukraine has surrendered, and the sort of that pressure to put pressure on local population or local activists who continue to go out on the anti-Russian protests and to the demonstrations. So it certainly was that pressure was a very significant factor, and that's why the people who did stand up to it and did continue to show their Ukrainian sentiment, that just showed how brave they were. So it's both the anti-Russian demonstrations, but also wider. We've seen So, for example, one story that we're working on right now is to do with schools in formerly occupied territories. And there were some teachers who were incredibly brave, and they continued to hold Ukrainian language lessons, Ukrainian literature lessons, history lessons. And it sort of beggars belief how brave they were and how they were putting up there. On the other hand, other people weren't. And for example, right now it's people I know, the director of secondary school in Berdyansk, so it's a city under occupation in south of Ukraine. She initially, it was that sort of standard procedure where the Russian representative of Russian authorities come in and they bring in the Russian school syllabus and say, this is what you're going to have to start teaching now. Initially, she refused, but then she was, she wouldn't describe in detail what sort of pressure was put on her, and I don't know if it was physical or just psychological, but eventually she started coming back into work, and it's done now teaching in Russian. So it's and we know about burning of Ukrainian textbooks and things like that. So it is very much, as you say, the propaganda front is really, really important, and it's for Russia to change people's minds and to trying to bring them closer into that orbit.
I mean, it was quite striking to hear that only 20% of people remain, in the city, that it is really depopulated and is now being destroyed. And I think that kind of is the challenge for Putin, how he's going to present that kind of Russia forever narrative, because you remember in the short version we've seen these officials saying Russia is here forever, so you better cooperate because there's no way back. Now that they've lost Kherson, they've lost actually Ukraine taking back roughly 50% of the territory that Russia occupied since the invasion. So and as they are preparing a new wave of attack as we speak right now, they surely will be much less tolerant to any kind of Ukrainians waving flags or the resistance movement that existed even in Kherson called Yellow Ribbon. I remember they were putting posters and organizing insurgency movement on the Russian-occupied territories. So, again, compared to 2014-15, Ukrainians are contesting and challenging, both within and outside of this Russian occupation of territory, and that's why this war, is getting into a new cycle, so to speak, because this propaganda is not really working anymore. People see what this is all about. Yes, please. Just one second.
It's Masato Kimura, a Japanese journalist. I have two questions. The first is about attacking hospital by Russian army, and the second is missing children in occupied area. And so in 2020, more than 700 hospitals were attacked by Russian army, according to WHO stats. And so it stopped or still going on. And if stopped, why? And so second question is, there are a lot of stories about missing children, and Russian brought them to somewhere. And could you tell us such stories?
Okay. Maybe we'll start with what information you have on children.
Yeah, so, excuse me. You're right, we've seen it. We've seen it in the media. We've seen reported, verified violations. Again, the attacking of hospitals and schools, for example, is a clear UN violation of child's rights. It's one of the 6 grave violations that is recognized by the Secretary General. So from our perspective, we are supporting where we can the UN mechanisms and other mechanisms rolled out by the International Criminal Court, particularly in our case, the monitoring and reporting mechanism, where the UN goes into Ukraine and verifies the attacks in order to have international accountability, or domestic where they can. And we are very much, as well as programming, to help deliver aid, we are very much fighting for child rights and upholding those norms of conduct, the international rules-based system that exists, and calling out and asking member states to condemn violations like we see. in regards to the children who have been potentially repatriated inside Russia and taken from orphanages, we're aware of that. We're providing, we're in discussions on that. I can't talk too much about it, but we're very much aware of it. And of course, that again is a violation. Abduction of children is a violation.
Just to add a little bit on that, from public reporting that I've heard, very often there were cooperations between international charities and Ukrainian orphanages, and whenever Russians would take over the territory, they would kick out the staff that would be working there and that knew the children, and then take over the orphanage, deny all the access to previous teams, and then they would move children and with no information further on. That is so hard to then track. But that's actually interesting whether any of the Russian human rights defenders, do you ever, for example, receive information from the Russian side that could be traced on children that are taken to Russia by force? Have you encountered that? Or you cannot share that information? I don't know.
But we work with all parties who are, working towards the international rules-based system. So.
Yes. So what I can add on the children that have been moved from Ukraine to Russia, there are all sorts of different cases and examples. So in some cases, it's, as we said, it's children taken from orphanages, but in some cases, it's children who were lost or separated from their families. So there are a lot of children who have, even the children who lived in children's homes, they very often have families. So they may not have full family or parents, both parents, but they very often have families who would have them, but they got moved into Russia. And they're very difficult situations. There is this Ukrainian NGO called Save Ukraine, which is working partly with the government, partly on its own, and it's trying to find as many of those children as possible and help their families get them back. But as Alison says, it's a very careful balance between doing it safely, and obviously help of people inside Russia is paramount. It's needed, and it is happening. But it's also happening on a sort of under the surface kind of basis, because otherwise the Russian ombudsman for children's rights, if you look on her, she's called Maria Lvova Belova, and it's her, and so she very much is using those children as another propaganda tool, and showing how these children were rescued from the war, or maybe in some cases from quote-unquote Nazi Ukrainian government, and now they're brought into Russia, given Russian citizenship in some cases, and there they are now for happy ever after. But there are people inside Russia who are working to help those children and to help their families, but it's not, that work cannot be public, because in Russia under the current government you cannot publicly show or talk about it or kind of announce it. But it's certainly something that is happening, and as time goes on, we will see more and more of it, because those cases are going into tens, if not hundreds of thousands, really a lot of children.
Thank you all very much. Ewan Grant, I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst who's worked on a number of EU programs in Ukraine, including just before and just after the Maidan, although that was coincidental. My question is based on the comments you made about fear of fatigue getting in the West, particularly the West, not Poland and the Baltic states. What can public opinion best do to keep the impetus up? And what do you think are the key points that perhaps public opinion isn't picking up on? One thing that I feel has been forgotten or not mentioned enough is that while the West is providing military assistance, Ukraine, of course, is providing an awful lot of military experience, which goes a long way to meet the cost of that assistance and will help our countries for decades to come. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Maybe we'll take one more question and then come back to the panel.
Thank you. My name's James Rogers. I'm an author and journalist and former BBC Moscow correspondent, in fact. Katerina, I wanted to congratulate you on the film, but also to ask you, and indeed your colleagues, yes, I know you're very keen to make sure credit is given where it's due. I wanted to ask, given that the very one-sided picture that we get of this in the West, for obvious reasons, it's very hard for independent journalists to function in Russia now. Do you hope to repeat this process somewhere? There were clearly ethical issues here and safety issues for your contributors, but is it an approach you hope you might be able to repeat elsewhere in Ukraine? Thank you.
I want to hand over in a minute to Albina, because it's about the ethical issues and how it was that for that film. I think it's important that she has she says a few words. Trying to repeat something like this and trying to cover stories from complex angles, yes, we're trying to do that all the time, but it is hard because there are editorial considerations, and yeah, our high-risk teams advisors are very, very busy, and editorial policies as well, because of those things. And that for example, the children's story of missing children, that's one of the things that we are now looking into and trying to cover, but it is hard, yeah. Albina is the director of this film, and it's really down to her creativity and energy that it became reality. And she knows better than anyone else what it was like for Dima to film it and to how it all actually happened and became reality.
Sure. So, just in terms of the security kind of
maybe if you
situation.
can stand up, because they cannot see you back. Yeah, don't be shy.
Maybe I can put a chair. Yeah, but in terms of the security issues around filming the process, the way we did it is, it was obviously in secret. It was a very dangerous situation for Dmytro to be in. So we were in very close contact, and we tried to kind of keep our communications very secure, transport the material in a secure way. And so it's it's quite a difficult operation. And then as the situation became more and more tense and more dangerous, we would kind of tell him, don't take any extra risks, don't go out with a camera. He filmed everything outside past a certain point with his mobile phone, and he only filmed with a kind of more or less professional camera inside the house. So, it was such a difficult experience also for us in London, because sometimes the internet would cut out, and frankly, if he got caught, it would be really bad news, because he would be, seen as a collaborator with the West, basically an enemy of the people. He could, all sorts of horrible things could happen. So, would we repeat this kind of experience somewhere else? I probably wouldn't right now, because it was very, you can't be responsible in the sense that you can't do much if something goes wrong, but you do feel responsible, and you have to be super careful. And the way the BBC operates, there's so many steps, to ensure it is as safe as possible in that circumstance. Michael, do you want to add anything?
Well, we started the film not knowing where it would end. We had no idea what would happen to Kherson or anything like that, and so it was just a sort of gamble, really, to try and grab the footage of a key moment. Albina had been through some of the occupations in Donetsk and Luhansk and knew what to expect and knew how pressure would likely ratchet up. And we thought, if this is going to happen again, then let's at least try and get it in the can. And hope that one day we are in a safe position to transmit it, and that was the gamble. And it was fortunate that the higher ups were prepared to take that gamble, because you couldn't ever guarantee a film at the end, or anything could happen. Anything could have happened. It is a model that we are looking at elsewhere, but just by the nature of it, it's not something we advertise. But it is that kind of citizen journalist gathering material over a long period of time, where we can verify and where we can make, be 100% certain that these events happened in that particular order, and that their reporting on it is fair and reasonably balanced. And then we can look at those kind of things, because there are lots of places where BBC just aren't welcome anymore, and the list is growing a bit. But
authorities.
By the authorities, yes. And that's one of the only ways you can ever get evidence of what's happening on the ground. And some pretty horrific stories in far-flung places which absolutely should be told, and that might be the only way of doing it. Yeah.
Just want to add one more thing, that when we were filming, of course, we didn't know that they would be leaving the occupation. So while they were in the occupation, it was not safe to reveal their identities, also because it's such a personal film, you see the whole family. There were some people we had to cut out because, for example, his parents stayed, and they were wonderful characters, but we had to cut them out because it just wouldn't be safe. So, it's just it's a kind of ongoing process. You don't really know when you start it, when it will end up, where it will end up, and when it would end up.
Thank you. There was also a question about, countering fatigue and...
Yeah, on public opinion. So, fundamentally, human stories are what moves humans, aren't they? Like we saw today. So. Of course, more of that we keep needing to show, and that's why it's great to see so much around the anniversary around the anniversary of this escalation coming through. We conducted some semiotic analysis a few years ago at Save the Children to see really what this is very much in a Western kind of UK-US context, but what moves people, and understood interesting findings around really needing, and this is not to degrade the geopolitics of Ukraine or the geographies or the the fact that we're in the same continent, but people need to consume a really simple story. And like World War II, Ukraine had a clear goodie who was quite attractive, and a baddie who was portrayed in almost a Bond-like, villain-like way in some outlets. And that resonated, and people could clearly hold on to it. With Syria, for example, we have found it so difficult, and Yemen, so difficult, and Iraq, I can go on, but so difficult to have that clear story for people to simply engage with, because it is complex. And the semiotics also showed us that the shift happened kind of Vietnam, where the home goodie state wasn't necessarily the goodie. Not to make it too bland, but that's how people connect, and that's what means people then go out of their way to organise fundraising events and continue this solidarity stuff. They also, just worth noting as well, I think the impacts of the Ukraine war on other crises, in terms of diverting attention away from other crises, but also the physical impacts. For example, one of the things I'm working on at the moment is the food crisis in East Africa. There are double the number of people who are dying of malnutrition and starvation across Somalia than there were last July, in part because of grain imports from Ukraine, fertilizer imports from Russia, but also because there's no attention in the media to launch the DEC appeal that then raises millions to help the aid effort. So it's really interesting, indirect impacts that we're seeing as well.
Yeah. So if I'm trying to see if there are, yeah, go ahead, Trish. More hands.
Thank you very, very much. My name is Trisha de Bourgrave. I'm a current affairs writer. I agree with you that the personal stories are heartbreaking and compelling, but people can fatigue of that as well, because there is this element that you think that, trying to help, trying to keep that narrative going, you will be buying into a government that is a sort of evil government for some cases. And I think where it becomes very important for Ukraine is that you can make the story bigger than just the individual, because it is about our personal freedoms, and it is about all of us losing those freedoms. And it's terrible because it does actually sideline Syria and it does sideline Iraq. But then there's a part of the West that goes, how much more can I do, give, contribute, when the ultimate result is not the government, the personal freedoms of those citizens. So I think you can do both with Ukraine. I think it's a very compelling mix of the two.
just a comment, I'm sorry.
And just to do a bit of also promo, I don't know if you get a chance to see our World Today issue. I mean, it was just released this week, and there are a lot of very good stories. I mean, also, you know, of invincibility and resilience and coverage of cultural, you know, voices speaking for women voices. Trisha did a story about women in war. I looked at how Ukraine's economic sector is not only surviving, but in a way also modernizing through new ways of procuring energy, new ways of city support to small and medium enterprises, various voucher programs. And I think, of course, the silver lining of it, that the war has such a dramatic impact on destroying the old system, that there's simply, you know, like in this saying, everything has to change in order for everything to stay the same. For Ukraine to survive as an independent nation, things have to change internally a lot. And so far, I agree with you, people are exhausted. It's now coming into the second war, into the new way, and all the time this psychological pressure, Putin is going to invade again, you know, in a big way. So I think that's why, you know, the West should understand that this game is way from being over and stand by. And I think the longer this lasts, and I think what Dmytro said in his a video message, that the aggressor only understands force. And before this meeting, we had a conversation with Ukrainian historian Serhiy Plokhy for a circle here in Chatham House, where he said from his experience of history, I mean, the longer we wait, the higher the cost will be eventually. So it's better to mobilize as much as we can today in order to both save lives and make this conflict shorter. So there's still a lot to ponder about and to work on various fronts, from the information front to a humanitarian front, and of course from, you know, places like Chatham House trying to devise some policies that will eventually bring back. I think Ukraine could be a certain watershed if we do it right, like in the biggest sense of things. So if there's any other inquiry, yes, please.
Hello, my name is Felix Corley. I'm from Forum 18. We cover freedom of religion or belief. We've covered a lot on occupied territory. You know, the seizing of places of worship, kidnapping of religious leaders, Protestant pastors, Greek Catholic priests, Orthodox priests from the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. I was quite interested last week. I spoke to an official in the culture ministry in Luhansk, and Luhansk was one of the most restrictive areas in terms of controlling religious communities during the occupation, well, since 2014. And I kept asking him, well, you know, you used to fine people, you banned Protestants, you banned Jehovah's Witnesses, you made life very difficult for the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And he was working there in the ministry before last October. Now he's the head of the religion department there. And he said, it's all changed now. We're now under Russian law. And he was explaining, well, you know, these communities that weren't allowed to exist before, they can apply, Russian law applies. And across the region there, you've got, you know, Russian courts being set up, the Russian criminal code is being imposed, the Russian administrative code, this type of thing. I mean, he was willing to talk. We spoke for 45 minutes, and before they'd almost snarl at you and then put the phone down, or, you know, they're really reluctant to talk. Do you detect any change there? Is it for the better or the worse?
I mean, for the access in the occupied territories that are now, you know, Russia annexed. Yeah, I don't know.
I don't really have a response on that, sorry. No, I'm not sure.
No, there are. So what we know from just information that we get through various means in those territories, as you say, they are being now treated as part of Russia. So various institutions and forms of government are being introduced, and so yes, it is happening. But it's this is not to say. So this was, for example, it started happening very quickly after the occupied territories were annexed, or officially, formally, you know, the decree was signed by President Putin in September, and yet less than 2 months later, much of that territory had been taken but liberated by Ukraine. So it's yes. So that process is underway, and it's very much part of the Russian news agenda. So this is now such and such oblast, and it's being treated and referred to in the news bulletins as a part of Russia. So it is a kind of fact, but it's obviously they're not. This annexation is not internationally recognized, and the events of the next few months of the spring offensive, which may or may not happen, and on which side. So we'll just have to see what happens.
I guess there's also a degree in terms of where they feel more secure, that they control things, because they've been there a longer time, since 2014, like you say. So they've really consolidated their control. They put their officials, or whereas these recent territories where they occupied, clearly there is internal resistance to that. There's insurgency. And I think we'll see a lot of movement along that front line, one way or the other. It's no way settled, and that means there will be more displacement from that territories because of increased fighting. And I guess the humanitarian sector has to be prepared for that. It was interesting. There was a lot of expectation of a move out of Ukraine, as there was electricity grid was targeted, but there were not so many actually fleeing this winter and adapting with generators and other batteries. I mean, I think Slovaks were setting up huge refugee shelters expecting a new wave, but that didn't happen. So it's very unpredictable, obviously. But I think we will be wrapping up, and I just would like to say words of gratitude for the BBC team, for the BBC World, of really doing this hard work, and I'm sure it took a lot of emotional energy and intellectual energy to produce such an excellent product. So thank you very much, and for Save the Children, for really, I think, nurturing that future of Ukraine. And it was interesting, again, bringing back to Dmytro, and he said Putin has lost the war because the way his daughter is, the way his daughter will grow up, and this war has no chance. It's just a matter of how long it lasts. So, I mean, thanks a lot for supporting the children in those difficult times, and thank you for coming, for the interest to the subject, and for all you do, I'm sure, on your own, and thanks for coming to Chatham House. Please join me in the round of applause.